State of Oklahoma executes a convicted murderer in McAllister. Kendrick Simpson was executed by lethal injection at the state penitentiary just a few hours ago.
January 14, 2026. Inside the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board hearing, Kendrick Simpson's case was down to one last decision. This was the final step outside the courts. If clemency was denied, the state would move forward with his scheduled execution. The board heard from both sides. Simpson asked to be spared. Prosecutors argued the verdict and sentence had already been tested through years of review. Relatives of the victims spoke about what they had lived with since January 2006, when Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones were killed. When the board members returned to their vote, it was brief. 3 voted against clemency. 2 voted in favor. The request failed. That result left the execution date in place. Simpson was scheduled to be executed on February 12, 2026, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. Soon after, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond released a statement saying the legal process had reached its end and that the outcome reflected the jury's decision and the years of appeals that followed. But the vote didn't settle the larger question people kept asking outside that hearing room. When a case runs for decades, what does justice mean at the finish line? If you want fact-based death row investigations built on records, testimony, and court decisions, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. January 15, 2006. Oklahoma City. Kendrick Simpson was 22 years old and had been living in Oklahoma only a short time after relocating from New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. That Saturday night, he went out with 2 friends, Jonathan Dwight Dalton and Latango Wayne Robertson, driving in Dalton's white Monte Carlo. Before they reached the club, prosecutors say Simpson made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He placed an AK-style rifle in the trunk of the car. No one at the entrance knew it was there. Inside, the night looked normal. Music, a crowded room, groups moving between tables and the bar. They arrived at Fritzy's, a hip-hop club in northwest Oklahoma City, close to midnight. At some point, Simpson crossed paths with 3 young men, Glenn Palmer, 20, Anthony Jones, 19, and London Johnson. A comment was made about Simpson's red Chicago Cubs cap. It wasn't a big moment to anyone else in the room, but it landed hard. According to testimony later presented in court, Simpson walked back to his friends and complained about the comment. He didn't leave it there. He approached the group again. Words were exchanged. At one point, he reportedly made a threat, language that suggested he wanted the confrontation to be taken seriously. Then Simpson did something that looked like a reset. He walked up to Palmer, extended his hand, and said, "We cool." Could have ended right there. Instead, Palmer struck Simpson, knocking him down. People separated. Both groups headed out. Not long after, both sets of young men ended up at a nearby convenience store and gas station, commonly described in accounts as a 7-Eleven stop. Palmer's group was there briefly. Simpson and his friends arrived soon after. This is where the night stopped being an argument and became a pursuit. As Palmer, Jones, and Johnson drove away, prosecutors say Simpson and his friends followed their vehicle through city streets for several miles. The cars moved through the dark in the same direction, the distance closing and opening, the decision repeating itself with every block. Then Simpson brought the rifle out of the trunk and into position. From Dalton's passenger side, prosecutors say Simpson pointed the weapon out the window and fired roughly 20 rounds into Palmer's car. The vehicle was struck repeatedly. The outcome was immediate and irreversible. Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones did not survive. London Johnson lived. And afterward, Simpson's own words, repeated later as part of the case record, captured the shift from confrontation to consequence. He referred to himself as a monster, acknowledging what he had just done. The investigation into Kendrick Simpson's actions began almost immediately after the shooting. Law enforcement quickly identified Simpson as a suspect. He had been involved in an altercation earlier that evening, and eyewitnesses provided key information. The sequence of events, though chaotic, was pieced together step by investigators. Witnesses testified that Simpson's car had been following Palmer's vehicle after the initial confrontation at the club. They traced the path taken by both cars until they stopped at a 7-Eleven, where Simpson and his friends had moments before the shooting occurred. Several witnesses were able to describe the actions of Simpson and his companions during the chase. Two key figures in the investigation were Jonathan Dwight Dalton and Latango Wayne Robertson, Simpson's friends. They both provided testimony that helped establish Simpson's role in the shooting. Dalton, the driver of the car Simpson was in, confirmed the car followed Palmer's group for several miles through Oklahoma City. Dalton's testimony would later be vital in proving that Simpson was not acting in self-defense but instead made a deliberate decision to pursue the victims. Latango Wayne Robertson, who was also in the car, corroborated Dalton's account of the events. Robertson provided more details about Simpson's behavior before, during, and after the shooting. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of premeditation and intent, with Simpson's actions showing a pattern of deliberate decisions rather than a spur-of-the-moment response. In addition to the testimonies of the two men, the investigation also relied on London Johnson, the sole survivor of the shooting. Johnson provided a crucial eyewitness account, detailing the moments leading up to the shooting, the vehicle pursuit, and what happened when the gunfire erupted. His testimony gave authorities a comprehensive understanding of the events, and his account was consistent with the physical evidence found at the scene. The evidence supporting the charge of first-degree murder was significant. Investigators collected ballistic evidence, showing that the shooting was not random, but a calculated attack. The fact that Simpson followed the vehicle for miles before opening fire was a critical element in establishing deliberation. The case against him was not based on a spontaneous outburst, but on a sequence of planned actions, beginning with the decision to arm himself and ending with the intentional firing of the rifle. Simpson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as discharging a firearm with intent to kill London Johnson, the surviving victim. This charge was significant because it showed Simpson's determination to eliminate anyone who could testify against him. In addition to witness statements, jailhouse informants would later testify about Simpson's behavior while in custody. One informant claimed that Simpson had shown little remorse for the killings and had even expressed intentions to silence potential witnesses. This testimony added weight to the prosecution's argument that Simpson was not a person who acted in the heat of the moment but one who had planned and calculated his actions. By the time the case went to trial, the evidence was clear. Kendrick Simpson's actions were not a mistake but a deliberate, premeditated crime. The first-degree murder charges were solidified, and the question of intent had been thoroughly answered through witness testimony and physical evidence. In 2007, the case moved from investigation to a courtroom, where prosecutors charged Kendrick Simpson with 2 counts of first-degree murder with malice aforethought. He also faced a count of discharging a firearm with intent to kill, tied to London Johnson, the surviving passenger, and a separate charge for possession of a firearm after a prior felony conviction. The state's theory was direct. This was not an accident, not a sudden loss of control, and not self-defense. Prosecutors argued the sequence of choices showed intent. Choices made before, during, and after the confrontation. They pointed to testimony from the people who were with Simpson that night. Jonathan Dwight Dalton and Latango Wayne Robertson, who had already entered guilty pleas as accessories, took the stand and described Simpson's actions and statements in the hours surrounding the crime. Their accounts were used to support the idea that this was deliberate conduct, not a split-second reaction. London Johnson's survival mattered in court for more than one reason. Prosecutors treated him as a key witness and as the basis for the intent-to-kill firearm charge. His account helped the jury understand what happened from inside the targeted vehicle, and it gave the state a way to argue that the danger wasn't limited to 2 victims. The defense faced a narrow path. They attempted to introduce mental health evidence through Dr. Philip Massett, who evaluated Simpson and raised concerns consistent with post-traumatic stress. The defense position was not that Simpson was legally insane, but that trauma-related symptoms could have affected judgment and response under stress. The judge limited how that evidence could be used. Under Oklahoma law, there is no general diminished capacity defense outside specific categories, and the court ruled that PTSD testimony could not be presented during the guilt phase to contest intent. That meant the jury's decision on guilt rested primarily on witness testimony, the timeline presented by the state, and the surrounding circumstances, not on an explanation of how trauma might have shaped perception or impulse. After the guilty verdicts, the trial moved into sentencing. Prosecutors presented aggravating factors, arguing the case met the legal threshold for the death penalty. The defense presented mitigation, asking the jury to weigh Simpson's history and mental health as context. The jury deliberated, then returned with 2 death sentences, one for each murder count, along with the additional convictions tied to the firearm charges. Kendrick Simpson grew up in New Orleans' 9th Ward. Records and later court filings described a childhood shaped by instability, raised by a teenage mother, surrounded by poverty, and exposed early to violence. His attorneys would later point to documented trauma and long-term stress reactions that, in their view, affected how he processed threat and conflict as a young adult. In the months before he came to Oklahoma, Simpson was still dealing with the aftermath of being shot multiple times in an earlier incident, followed by repeated medical treatment. After Hurricane Katrina, he left New Orleans and resettled in Oklahoma City as a displaced resident, trying to rebuild in a place where he had no long history, no deep network, and little support. But the state also pointed to another part of his record, one that complicated any simple explanation. Before the 2006 case, Simpson had been incarcerated for an armed home invasion robbery in which a business owner was shot and survived. Prosecutors highlighted that prior offense as evidence of a pattern, not just hardship but repeated high-risk violence and the willingness to use a firearm during serious crimes. On the other side of the case were 3 young men whose lives were moving in a very different direction. Glenn Palmer was 20 years old. Anthony Jones was 19. Both were described by their families as young men with plans that were still forming, work, friendships, and the normal expectations of early adulthood. Their names would later become tied to a single night that their families say never stopped replaying. London Johnson was in the same vehicle and survived. In the years that followed, he became a father of 6. In public statements, he described carrying the memory of what happened with him for years, not as a story to tell, but as something that stayed close and personal. 2 family voices became central in the public record as the case moved through later stages. Crystal Allison, Glenn Palmer's sister, spoke repeatedly about what it meant to live with the loss over time. Talisha Jones, Anthony Jones's sister, also addressed officials and the public, describing how her family measured the case not in court dates, but in years without her brother. By 2019, Kendrick Simpson's case had already moved through years of state and federal review. That year, his attorneys filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court arguing ineffective assistance of counsel. Specifically, that trial representation during the penalty phase failed to present and develop key mitigation in a way that could have changed the outcome. The court declined to take the case, leaving prior rulings in place and narrowing Simpson's remaining options. In late 2025, the legal fight shifted again, this time away from the facts of the crime and toward the mechanics of how Oklahoma carries out executions. On October 16, 2025, Simpson filed a federal civil rights lawsuit challenging Oklahoma's execution protocol and the state's process for how those procedures are set and reviewed. The case centered on constitutional claims, due process, access to courts, and equal protection, arguments that have become common in late-stage capital litigation. The state moved to dismiss, arguing the federal court either lacked authority to intervene or that the claims were not legally actionable at that stage. Assistant Attorney General Christopher Howard was among the officials arguing the state's position in public proceedings tied to the final review period, framing the case as one that had already been tested repeatedly and should not be reopened through procedural challenges. Brad Clark, representing the Oklahoma Attorney General's office in public-facing remarks, pointed back to the trial record and the series of denials that followed, emphasizing that multiple courts had already reviewed the conviction and sentence. As the execution date approached, Simpson's attorneys made one more emergency request to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court declined to block the execution, closing the last federal door available to him. At the Clemency hearing, Kendrick Simpson spoke in his own words and did not contest what the jury had already decided. He told the board he was ashamed of being a murderer. He apologized to the families of Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. He also apologized to London Johnson, the man who survived being in the same vehicle. Simpson asked the board for mercy, adding that he was not the worst of the worst, and rejecting the label he had used years earlier when he called himself a monster. His attorneys argued that clemency exists for cases like this, where the legal process may be complete, but the board still has discretion to weigh life history, mental health, and any documented change over time. Their request was not framed as an excuse. It was framed as a final judgment about punishment. Victim relatives opposed clemency. Crystal Allison, Glenn Palmer's sister, spoke about living with the loss and what it meant to see the case approach its final stage. Talisha Jones, Anthony Jones's sister, also addressed the board, arguing that mercy for Simpson would ignore the damage done to their families. After the statements ended, the board voted. The result was 3-2 against recommending clemency, narrow and enough to divide the public response immediately. February 12, 2026. At the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, the state carried out its first execution of the year. Kendrick Simpson was brought into the execution chamber in the morning hours. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Don Heath, stood nearby and read scripture as the procedure began. Oklahoma used a 3-drug lethal injection protocol. Prison officials later confirmed that Simpson was pronounced dead at 10:19 a.m. Central Time. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond released a statement afterward saying the execution delivered justice for Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones, and expressing hope that it offered their families some measure of peace. Among the witnesses was Palmer's sister, Crystal Allison. Afterward, she described being disturbed by Simpson's demeanor in the chamber, saying the expression she saw in his final moments brought back the weight of the past 2 decades. Kendrick Simpson's execution took place during a renewed period of capital punishment enforcement in Oklahoma. After a 6-year moratorium that followed problems with prior executions, the state resumed carrying out death sentences in 2021. By early 2026, Oklahoma had carried out more than a dozen executions since that restart, placing it among the most active death penalty states in the country during that period. Nationally, capital punishment remains one of the most contested issues in criminal justice. Some states have abolished it entirely. Others continue to use it, often after lengthy appellate review. The arguments are consistent across jurisdictions. For some, it is a necessary response to the most serious crimes. For others, it raises concerns about fairness, proportionality, and whether a person can meaningfully change over decades in custody. Simpson's case drew attention in part because it intersected with that broader debate. His defense had argued that mental health history and documented trauma should carry weight when the ultimate punishment is considered. Supporters of clemency pointed to his conduct during years on death row and asked whether the justice system should measure a person only by their worst act. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond took a different position. In public statements following the execution, he said justice had been served for Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones and that the case had been reviewed thoroughly at every level of the courts. Reverend Don Heath, who stood with Simpson on the day of the execution, offered another view. He described Simpson as a changed man and questioned whether execution reflected who he had become after nearly 2 decades in prison. Crystal Allison, speaking from the perspective of a sister who lost her brother at age 20, emphasized that no passage of time altered the loss her family endured. For her, accountability remained the central issue. 3 perspectives. 1 case. A legal system asked to balance transformation against consequence. Subscribe for in-depth death row investigations grounded in verified evidence and balanced analysis.